design, Langston had written what's called musical cues. He wrote the poem, I'll just give you a little background. He wrote the poem in 1960. He had been asked to serve as the MC for the Newport Jazz Festival that had Muddy Waters, Count Basie, John Coltrane, Duke Ellington. It was like a who's who of the jazz world was going to be there that year. And the festival had been oversold by about 2,000 tickets. Mostly young white males had purchased tickets and couldn't get in. They were not happy about that. A riot ensued, and the governor of Rhode Island called out the National Guard and basically shut down the Newport Jazz Festival. The great impresario George Wein, who was the producer of the festival, he and Langston were very good friends, so he asked Langston to go out and sort of offer a benediction to kind of bless and close the festival because the festival was having to close early. So Langston was so moved by that event and also what was happening in the world at that time. We know from our history the civil rights movement, the struggle in Africa with Ghana, Nasser, Nkrumah, Kenyatta. So this poem became Langston's anthem addressing the struggle for freedom and equality among Africans and African Americans throughout the world. He used, the leitmotif that he used was from a piece that was written by W.C. Handy, the father of the blues, called Hesitation Blues. And the lyrics go, "How long must I wait? Can I get it now, or must I hesitate?" Now, a song was written from the perspective of a man trying to have a conquest with a woman. And he's asking that question. How long must I wait? Can I get it now, or must I hesitate? In Langston's brilliance, however, he took that same phrase and juxtaposed it to the civil rights movement. For those who had been disenfranchised, who couldn't, sit on the counter and have a bowl of soup, or couldn't purchase a home where their means would allow. The question became, how long must I wait? Can I get it now, or must I hesitate? So Langston had planned to collaborate with the great bassist Charles Mingus and also the pianist and composer Randy Weston. Sadly, Langston passed away before he could actually realize the work as he had intended, and I'm very proud to say that we were the first, even though the first inaugural performance was pretty, in the eyes of me, was pretty sad. But I noticed that people were kind of nodding their head, bobbing their heads, and tapping their feet. We were a great band, we just weren't rehearsed. And I thought to myself, I said, imagine how good this could be if we actually rehearsed. And we did, and that was almost 20 years ago. And I'm very happy to say that we have done thousands of performances of the Langston Hughes Project all over the country, all over the world actually. I was just telling Shana, we have a mantra with our project is that we will go where Winter Marsalis will not go. So consequently, yesterday we were in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, Omaha, Nebraska, Kalamazoo, Michigan. I view this project as sort of being an expansion of my classroom here at USC, because in addition to doing the actual performance, in fact, we've added to it. Now it becomes the actual spoken word. We have the music that I composed, that we rehearsed, and we have videography, because what I found, just like Shana was saying, particularly with young people, there's a disconnect historically. And the poem is so densely written that it requires, I look at it as you would a Picasso painting or Romero Bearden painting. You can't look at it one time and say, oh, got it, and move on to the next one. It requires repeated visits. So this work, as I composed the music, I had to literally read the poem, each mood, over and over and over again to try and figure out what is Langston talking about here, and how can I create sounds that will correlate with this text. So we did that, and we hired a videographer to craft images that would also correlate with the poem. So as we're talking about, Bahia, we're talking about Nina Simone, we're talking about John Coltrane, we're talking about singers like Odetta and that statue on Bedloe's Island, managed by Saul Rock. Who are those individuals? So we had to figure out a way to kind of connect the names, the places, events with the music and with the images. And like I said, we've been doing it now for almost 20 years, and there's still tremendous demand for it. And as long as they will call us, we will come. So I'll stop at that point.
I just want to also echo my fellow panelists. Thanks and gratitude for all of you being here today, and again, to be able to share conversation with everybody up here is totally inspiring. I've learned massive amounts from everybody up on this panel, and I'm thrilled to be here. Start by telling you that in 1928, the Department of Playground and Recreations here in Los Angeles published a little book, a little tiny kind of leaflet book called Los Angeles is Singing. And it was subtitled The Official Songbook of Los Angeles. And it was nothing more than 100 different songs, the lyrics to 100 different songs for people to sing. But alongside the song lyrics, the city published a list of every single public park in Los Angeles. And the point of the book was to urge everyone around LA to go to their local public park, or maybe not their local public park, but to a public park, and to go out in public and sing a song. And to sing a song with their neighbors, or to sing a song with somebody that they have never met before, which could, of course, we're in LA, be your neighbor. Maybe that's the only time you ever want to deal with them. And to embrace, as Shana was saying, embrace the power of singing as community building, as mobilizing. And buried in this little pamphlet in 1928 was this kind of this idea about civic reform, that if we could just have these kind of public sing-ins, then we all might be able to hear each other a little bit better. We might actually understand how to be with each other a little bit better. And of course, when we try to sing with each other, now I'm not, unlike Shana, I can't hit notes. But for all of you who have tried to hit notes, right, that's part of the act of democracy, it's part of the act of building coalitions, of trying to hit those notes. And most importantly then, listening to the person next to you to decide when to start singing, when to lower your voice, what note to hit, when to be in harmony, when not to be in harmony. And so that singing and playing music and listening to music becomes a political act in that core sense, right? It becomes about how we measure ourselves in the scope of a larger sense of community. And so I've been obsessed for a long time with this idea of a singing city, of what it might be. We've got Ciclavia, right? Many of you might have been involved with Ciclavia last week, 2 weeks ago. What if we have Songlavia, right? I'm trying to get Aaron Paley to greenlight Songlavia one day, where we all sing, close all the streets for us all to sing together. But this is something that about 2010, Ken Brecker, who's the head of the Library Foundation of Los Angeles, called me and asked if I'd want to explore these ideas about singing in the city by looking through the sheet music collection of the LA Public Library, which numbers about 100,000 pieces of sheet music, in individual pieces and in songbooks. And so for about 2 years, I had a group of my undergraduate and graduate students here at USC, and we went over there and looked through all of these songs. And we put together what is still the first ever and only sheet music collection of Southern California. And these are all songs written in and about Los Angeles and Southern California from late 1860s up through the 1960s. And our project really was to try to understand why we hadn't heard of 99% of these songs. I should say most of these songs were never recorded. So these were songs that were either written by professionals who were trying to get them recorded, or were written by everyday folks who were writing songs inspired by Los Angeles. And part of the project's goal was to figure out what it might mean to approach Los Angeles as a singing city. Not to pick one song, but to understand the kind of multitude, the multiplicity of songs about Los Angeles. The earliest one we found was 1867, was a song called The Wines of Los Angeles County, which was all about LA as a wine-growing capital. And one of the most important later ones that we found was, speaking of anthems, what is still the official anthem of Los Angeles, the official song of Los Angeles, and probably nobody has heard it, is Angel Town. Anyone? Which was actually written by Jay Livingston and Ray Evans, two prominent Hollywood songwriters and composers. They wrote Que Sera Sera, among many others. And prompted by an LA Times columnist, they wrote a song in 1959 called Angel Town, meant to be the official song of LA. And it was total boosterism, Come out, it was like, come out here, settle down, build a fence, here the future is present tense. And on the cover was a couple arm in arm looking over this untouched valley of unspoiled nature in Los Angeles. And it struck us that this was 1959, and they're looking at an LA that looks like it's from the 19th century. Not the 1959 of post-World War II Los Angeles, not the 1959 of massive African-American migration, not the 1959 of massive Mexican migration, not a city that's riddled with racial segregation and strife. It was a utopia of what LA looked like. And what we found going through this collection over and over again was this tension, this battle between the myth of the kind of sunshine, unspoiled paradise of Los Angeles and its multiracial and multicultural realities. And so that was our goal with this book, Songs in the Key of Los Angeles, was to bring to life a kind of alternative musical history of LA in song. Maybe I can talk a little bit later about some of the ways that we try to bring that to life. But our goal was really to kind of use music as a model of community to not just deal with the past, which is incredibly important, of course, as we all in all of our work do, but to then use that historical lesson to deal with contemporary politics and, just as important, the politics yet to come.
My book is called Natural Mystics, The Prophetic Lives of Bob Marley and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan. And it really comes out of my training as a scholar of religious studies. When I was younger, I tried to read as many spiritual classics as I could. And there's one that really sort of stuck with me throughout my career. It's called The Mysticism of Sound and Music by Hazrat Inayat Khan. If you haven't read it, I really recommend it. And there was a quote that I carried with me, quote, "Music excels religion, for music raises the soul of man even higher than the so-called external form of religion. That is why in ancient times, the greatest prophets were great musicians." And as I began to think about this quote, I realized that in my life, my favorite musicians were also prophetic voices. They were prophetic in the biblical sense in terms of their engagement with compassion and beauty and justice. So I believe that this quote really isn't just about ancient times, it's really about contemporary times. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that two musicians in particular who I adored, Bob Marley, the great reggae singer and Rastafarian icon from Jamaica, and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, the great Sufi singer and virtuoso musician from Pakistan, really embody these new types of prophetic voices through popular culture. So this book really examines Bob Marley and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan not just as musical geniuses, but also as spiritual geniuses, not just as virtuoso musicians, but also as prophetic musicians, as significant religious figures in our day and in our time. In the book, I explore a few big ideas about what does it mean to be a prophetic musician, mediating popular culture, politics, economics, and spirituality. The first idea I talk about is mystical intoxication. Both Bob Marley and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan were modern-day mystics, and they saw themselves as messengers who oriented their life and their work around revelation and transcendence. They transmitted this type of mystical consciousness through their music, almost like a sonic theology. And they used this idea of intoxication very deliberately. For Bob Marley, it was this idea of Irie. For Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, it was the idea of must. These notions that intoxication resembles divine consciousness, whether it be literal or metaphoric. The second is this notion of political appropriation. Both Bob Marley and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan became part of the post-colonial narratives of Jamaica and Pakistan, respectively. And they're also one of the, especially Bob Marley, was arguably the first third world superstar. And Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan is also a third world superstar. And so even though they didn't engage formally with politics, they were appropriated by various political actors for different reasons, whether it be to celebrate the nation state or even to denigrate them for their religious beliefs that some people find to be heterodox. And the third idea that I explore is this notion of media proliferation, or the ability to utilize available channels of technology to spread your message as far as possible. I believe that prophecy has always been a function of technology. In ancient times, it took a long time to get your message out because it was basically an oral tradition. So you had to wait until everyone heard from someone else what that message was. But with the rise of the printing press, say in the medieval times, suddenly prophecy is transmitted all over the world much quicker. And in this day and age, in the age of transnational media, you can instantaneously spread a message around the world. So whereas The great monotheistic Western religions of the world took hundreds of years to permeate every corner of the globe. Bob Marley spread Rastafarian, the Rastafarian faith throughout the world in just 10 years, and that's really a function of technology. So ultimately, I argue that we should view these songs as new types of religious texts, especially in a day and age where the largest growing religious demographic is that community that is not formally affiliated with any religious tradition. I believe that, on our campus, on university campuses, almost 40% of our students are not formally affiliated with any religious tradition, yet only 2% are atheists. So they're still involved in this idea of, what is the nature of God, what is the meaning of my life, what is my purpose, how do I live an authentic and significant life? But they're finding answers to those questions in non-traditional texts, through popular culture, through film, fashion, sports, and I argue, through religion. And what I really admire about our panelists here is each of their work really challenges the notion of what is a text, specifically what is a scholarly or a research text. And I want to ask them each a question about that, and I know it's tough for professors, but I'll ask them each to keep their answers to 2 minutes so we can have a Q&A with all of you. But I'll start with Josh. Josh, in the songs in the key of Los Angeles, you engage your students as collaborators. You used archiving as creative pedagogy. Can a music archive also be an interdisciplinary teaching tool? And how does LA sheet music also serve as a historical and cultural text for understanding Southern California? I know it's insane.
Put the clock up, man. Put the clock up.
To answer that in 2 minutes.
Oh boy. Well, okay, I'll try. So one of our motivations in looking at this collection was the belief that this collection already exists at LAPL. The music librarians have done an amazing job. The collection exists. So our job was not to preserve the past, right? Our job was to reanimate it. And so we did a book based on all these sheet music covers. We went into the recording studio with 5 contemporary artists here in Los Angeles and asked them to record these songs for the very first time and reinterpret them. We did an exhibit, and then we had a series of live musical performances where contemporary artists reinterpreted these songs live on stage for new contemporary audiences. So that was one of the interdisciplinary approaches that we took, was to examine these texts across different platforms. And yes, to take something that is as forgotten and as disposable, though sheet music is coming back with an incredible digital vengeance at the moment, but something that has been as discarded and overlooked as sheet music, and to understand sheet music not only as musical texts or texts for musical performance, but as graphic design text, visual art text, but most importantly as historical, cultural, social, ethnic, economic documents. That each piece of sheet music was a window into a lost moment in LA history. And the goal was not to rarefy these things and make them kind of perfect archival objects, but to do the opposite. It was to bring them back into public use. And to make people want to go check the songs out and make us all want to sing the songs, and to even, in the most ideal frame, go out and write the new songs of Los Angeles and design the art for the new songs of Los Angeles. 1 minute, 58 seconds.
Shana, Anthem is not just a book, but also a mixtape that you collaborated on with the Dread Star movement, which is available to stream online. As a musician, an activist, and a scholar, what is your vision of Anthem, the mixtape, as a companion soundscape for your book? And in what ways does the mixtape also serve as a scholarly text?
Yeah, when writing about music, it was really important to me that I actually give people something to listen to, right? Because there's only so much I can do with the written word. There's only so much that any of us can do to actually translate these songs for people. So it was really important to me that I kind of return to the source, right? Because it was really the music that got me interested. It was the sounds produced by these songs that got me interested in telling their history. So I wanted to bring that kinesis back to the project. And it was also something that's been haunting me for a little while. I remember giving a presentation on this project, which grew from my dissertation while I was still in graduate school, and someone said to me that writing about music is like dancing about architecture. And I think that's a pretty amazing project. I think everyone should dance about architecture. So I took it as a real challenge, though, to think about how best to translate all of these elements for folks. And so it was important to me that I do this other piece, which was produced by someone I went to college with, who is a graduate student currently, but is also an amazing DJ and produced so much of this project outside of my surveillance and did a fantastic job with it. So the mixtape is about 45 minutes long. You can find it on Mixcloud, and it's called Anthem, the Mixtape. And it includes all of the 7 songs that I discuss in the book, so I have the 6 chapters, and then I finally have a conclusion about Fight the Power as the last Black anthem of the 20th century. And so it covers all of those 7 songs, but has snippets of interviews and speeches from Black activists throughout the 20th century. It has spoken word, so it actually begins with an Oscar Brown piece about the auction block, and is kind of tracking this history, again, throughout the 20th century. The staple singers are in there, Billie Holiday is in there, you know, all of these people who I just didn't have the time or space to talk about in the book. And so in that way, it's the part 2 to the book. It does a lot of the work that I just could not do in the confines of a scholarly book. And all of us, you know, have faced those limitations and felt confined by them, but I felt really free and opened up by doing this mixtape, and I hope that people enjoy it and use it alongside the book or even independent of it, because it's telling its own unique story.
Ron, the Langston Hughes Project not only brings together literary and musical genres, but also different types of media. In many ways, the project resides at the intersection of music, art, poetry, and documentary, and has an online component. How has the multimedia and multidisciplinary aspect of the Langston Hughes Project shaped the message of the project, as well as the audience reaction?
I think that by having this be a multimedia presentation, it allows the words to become a little more accessible to people. People can understand what Langston was talking about. Now, first of all, Langston was someone who wrote in a vernacular that was easily accessible by most people. It didn't matter if you had a PhD or if you had finished high school. You could always pretty much understand what Langston Hughes was talking about. As I mentioned, the visual piece, given the fact that we're living in an age now where particularly young people are very visual. I mean, it's hard for them to sit still for an hour and a half of listening to jazz music. I mean, they start looking at their watches, they start texting, they start doing other things. But if there's an image on the screen, particularly if the image correlates with the actual text, then and then with the music serving as sort of a live soundtrack, this is what they're familiar with. They are accustomed to seeing images, hearing music, and also perhaps hearing text. There's one other thing I want to mention. I think this is so important. I often quote the ethnomusicologist Alan Lomax when he says, "As we live, so do we sing." And that statement to me means that religion, politics, economics, social conditions, all those variables have an impact on how we deal with music. In other words, if you want to get a sense of what a culture was like, take a look at the art. The art will inform you, this is what was going on at that given time. So me primarily as a jazz musician, and that's kind of what I am first and foremost, and I suppose morphed into these other areas over time, I've become very interested in how people, I've become interested in how can I create teachable moments or opportunities for people to learn. And I've used this music in this particular performance as a means of hopefully people leaving the concerts with a sense of being curious. Who was Langston Hughes? When did he live? What was the Harlem Renaissance about? So I think if that happens for me in our performances, then I feel good about what we've done.
I could ask the panel questions all afternoon, but I really want to hear from you and open it up for questions and answers. So we have a microphone here, and please feel free to come up and ask questions to individual panelists or to the panel as a whole.
Don't you all speak at once? There we go, that's my break, so.
No, there's so much pressure. I don't know, like do this.
No one's watching.
Anyway, part of what I wanted to ask is, you know, we live in a culture today that's just bolting overall in terms of the dominant culture in society. And each one of you, and particularly when you're talking about anthems, or when you're talking about Langston Hughes, or some of what I know about your work, Josh, in terms of, you know, various musicians, including Do You Want to Know? You know, there's a whole situation here where it's really, those things became so powerful in connection with big social struggles that were going on, with things where people were looking for inspiration, but also different ways to interpret the world and to try and change the world. And today, it seems really, to me, it's a really pressing need. We need a culture of revolt against a revolting culture. We need something that's actually going to stand up and fight for this in a sense that inspires people, not in a dogmatic, sort of preaching kind of way, but something that really grabs hold of Langston Hughes' work. When you could see what he said, and it's true, it resonated with so many people, but particularly, it spoke to something very basic in society and in human needs, in terms of striving for liberation in every sense. How important do you see that in connection to this fight to get what good culture is out there today, what exists but is being suppressed, repressed, hidden away, doesn't have the kind of exposure it needs? How do you see that in relation to what you've been talking about? I'd like to hear what you have to say about in relation to Langston Hughes, because I've actually followed that. What was that one project that had the mule train? Anyway, I can talk about it later. But it was basically, I'd like any one of you. I'd like to hear about you, but I'd like to hear from all three of you actually.
I'll be very brief because I know that our time is fleeting. My sense is that great art, those who have something of substance to say, will always find its way to the top. I just saw on the news the other day where Quincy Jones said something derogatory about Lil Wayne. And of course everybody's all up in arms about what Quincy said about Lil Wayne. Quincy said, well, I work with Ella Fitzgerald and all these great artists, and I don't quite understand Lil Wayne. And I think some of what I have seen in my lifetime in terms of how art, sort of quality art, and again, not to get into this whole discussion of what's good versus bad art, but the things that stand the test of time, usually they last. We can see Duke Ellington, he would be with us for the end of time. Stravinsky, Beethoven, Brahms, Berlioz, Ray Charles, Michael Jackson. They will always be a part of what we're trying to do in terms of telling our story. So I think the whole idea of there being this consensus of how we move as a people. One thing I know about Langston was more about bringing people together than dividing people. He was about looking at the good, all the things that all of us want. We want to have a happy life. We want to be able to raise our families. We want to be able to live and be able to have the same kinds of freedom that everyone else has. This is what Langston was about. So I think that kind of message will always permeate some of the negativity and some of the other things that we perhaps don't want to have to deal with.
I teach a post-civil rights Black America course here at USC, and part of the reason that I wanted to do that is because this narrative of we have no social movements is so prominent, right? We have no culture of resistance in the contemporary moment. I want to push back on that and argue that we do have a culture of resistance. It may just not exist in the formation that we're used to, right? That we've taken on different types of platforms, different types of approaches and strategies in responding to the world in which we live. And quite often it happens at the very local level. So for all of the news that we hear about Chicago and the killings and everything else, political corruption, there are also very vibrant social movements happening in Chicago at the very local level, even at the level of the neighborhood. And that there are musicians who are growing from those ranks to actually begin to speak on those issues and grow a platform for discussion on them. And I think that that is something that has historical precedent. If we think about a song like We Shall Overcome, again, it grew out of Black women, by and large, striking a tobacco plant in 1945 Charleston. Okay, this was in coordination with other labor unions, but this was not the general strike across the nation that anyone wanted, right? This was happening at the very local level. And this song grew from that struggle and became a global anthem, right? And so I want to encourage my students in particular to think about not just how music becomes kind of ancillary or becomes even a soundtrack for a movement, but how music is the spark that starts movements, right? And so I think it has to work on both ends, that we have activists who are propelling the growth of critical resistance, but we also have musicians who are speaking truth to the world, and that can also be a catalyst for getting people moving politically.
I would also say a place to look. I really agree, Shana, with that, with what you said, and I want to kind of join you in pushing back on that idea, which we all feel, obviously. But not only did it, resistance and social movements never look the same. They never look like they're supposed to, right? So we need to find new ways of looking and listening for them. One place that I think is really inspiring and important to look at is the immigrant rights movement in the United States, particularly since 2006. So in 2006, we had the largest public civil rights demonstrations in the history of the country, right? And yet we've basically written those out of history already in many ways, and forgotten about not only the intense impact of those pro-immigrant rights marches on social movement organizing, but about musical participation, about what I'm trying to write about right now is musical civic engagement. So if you look at regional Mexican music, what we call regional Mexican music in the United States, you look at banda music and norteño music, you're looking at music that is being sung and made by young Latinos across the United States that might not be protest songs explicitly, right? Expressly political in that way, but are songs about the struggles of living as an undocumented young person in this country, songs about stories of crossing the border, songs about losing loved ones to a drug war, songs about immigrant rights that might not be about rights, but are about just wanting to be able to be free in your daily life. These are songs that are on the Billboard Top 20. Right? These are pop songs. These are super commercial Spanish language songs put up by major record labels that are about a community's struggles to live and love, right? And I think that if we can look at the example of what young Latinos have been doing at the very least, but certainly all century long, but certainly galvanized by the events of 2006, that's one place where I think the idea of a movement is about literally movement, the freedom to move across borders or the freedom not to move. So the movement is the movement in this music, and we need to listen for that as well. But I think it's good that we should always be kind of on alert for your excellent model of revolting culture against revolting culture. Great.
That in the work that I do around reggae music specifically, Marley really is this anthematic figure who has been appropriately embraced by lots of progressive and revolutionary movements around the world. He's maybe the most recognized face in the world these days. I've seen Marley posters from Tibet to Indonesia to, my wife and I went to Zanzibar a few years ago to go on Freddie Mercury pilgrimage because he was born there, and we were standing outside his house and there was nothing about Freddie Mercury, but everyone was selling Marley stuff. So I was just, throughout my life I've been disappointed by what happened to roots reggae of the 1970s after Marley's death. I felt like it sort of disintegrated into this dance hall music that was homophobic and misogynistic instead of politically progressive. But as part of my research, I got to hang out with the Marley family. I spent time with Damian Marley in the studio when he was recording with Nas, the album Distant Cousins, which I think is a very interesting, politically important album. And maybe what, in the United States anyway, what we're seeing is not so much that the protest music is at the top of the charts. I mean, guys like John Lennon or Bob Dylan or Bob Marley or Fela Kuti, they weren't just protest musicians, they were also best-selling musicians who were also at the top of the charts and in some ways created their own genres. In the United States, we might not see that because corporations own more and more of those chart toppers, and it seems like popular music has moved from concept albums to catchy singles to ringtone hooks. But there's never been a time where there's been more music out there that's accessible to a larger audience. So many new types of voices, new types of stories. So I think when we're feeling disheartened about the state of music, then we really have to get into those subaltern narratives and see what's going on online through independent platforms and through musicians we might not have heard of in the popular sphere. Please.
So I had a question about, so you wrote each of you have written a book, and you touched on it briefly, but what is the call of action that you maybe expect or want, like people from readers or like the audience members today, what do you want us to do, and like especially what you said about the LA anthem, you know, I'm born and raised here in LA, and I never knew that LA had an anthem, and I think that there's kind of a sense of there's no community in LA. I feel like that it's kind of like sporadic. There's smaller communities, but there isn't really a movement or a sense of like togetherness here. And so what do you what do you expect the call of action, and what do you want people to do?
That'd be what my call to action
Well, all three of you, but you know, I was just resonating
Sure.
with what you said about
I
being
think
in
well,
LA.
one of our calls to action is to resist that there is a single song of Los Angeles. So I actually don't like the idea that we would have to look for one song. I don't like the idea that we need one community that somehow represents Los Angeles. I think what makes LA LA is the fact that you can't have a single community that thinks and acts and behaves in the exact same way. Now, that doesn't mean we can't have coalitions and work together, but it means recognizing the incredibly important differences between communities, the different histories, the different ways that different people and communities are allowed to inhabit this city freely or unfreely, historically and in the present moment. So if we just look to like Angel Town, trust me, you don't want that to be your anthem, no offense to the estate of Evans and Livingston, who've been very kind, that we need multiple songs always being made by every new generation all the time. And we all need to, I think, it's as much about singing songs, and what I guess the call to action is, and this might, I think, resonate with the work that all of us do on this panel, is about our jobs as listeners, about how to kind of really think about what we do, even if we're not making music, about how we listen to music, what we want from music, and how we listen to the voices of other people, and what we do with the stories and the songs and the experiences that we consume and hear every day from other people's bodies, other people's voices, and how do we learn from what other people sing about. So I guess that would be the first step, was to maybe postpone the idea that we need one thing and embrace the fact that we need multiple always.
Very quickly for me, music and art is meant, we are storytellers first and foremost. And as a performer, I want people to leave my performances in a very thought-provoking manner. I want them to leave thinking about issues. I want people to not just be passive, disengaged listeners, but people who will hopefully hear and see what we've done and feel moved enough to do something themselves. It could be something very small, or it could be something very large. But to digest the music and the art in such a way that you are moved, because music and art is about emotions and feelings. And this is what separates us from other forms of life. We have emotions and feelings, and it's that passion that moves us to become engaged in some type of movement, no matter what it is.
I would just say, from my perspective in terms of religion, what I see happening in the United States is a movement away from institutional religion to personal spirituality. And I feel like what that means is it's a movement away from answers to questions. So my call to action would just be for people to ask and live those questions in their life. The question of what should my call of action be? And that kind of approach that is decentralized and individualized, I think reflects what Josh was talking about in terms of what Los Angeles is. Maybe it's a decentralized city, but how can that be something positive as opposed to something negative?
My basic statement to all of my students is, when you listen better, you think better, and when you think better, you do better. So that would be the equation that I would hope would inspire people.
As an undergraduate, I studied Claude Levi-Strauss, and the basic idea was thesis, antithesis, synthesis. And I think I see that often in music, especially today with the digital communities and the digital music. People are sampling and people are taking different forms and genres of music and mixing them in a pace that's very rapid these days. And so my question, I think, is mostly for Shana, in terms of how you've seen these anthems in your work and the role they have in communities. How do we move from more rapidly from a new synthesis to the next antithesis, and do so in a way that sort of empowers community and empowers action, rather than keeping people just listening passively?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think that part of the narrative of linking these songs has been to think about how each of them is responding to the anthem that preceded them, and how there's always this dynamic engagement that's happening between the musicians, but importantly through the movements, right? That they're trying to build and do better than the last movement did, to incorporate more people, to think harder about intragroup difference, right? That even as these are Black social movements, there are still concerns and questions and struggles around gender and nation and class and sexuality and all of these things that connect us to one another but can also cause concern and division. But then part of what I do in the conclusion of the book is to try and think about the resonance of these anthems, these songs that we don't necessarily know anymore, aren't on the tips of our tongues, or may not even know exist. And to think about how they come back through remix, through code, through innuendo. So for example, someone like Nina Simone, we still know about in part because so much of her music has been used by hip hop MCs, right? Common is someone who regularly uses her work. Kanye West regularly uses her work. So to think again, and then also about Ethiopia being adopted by the Rastafarianisms as Rastafarian movement as one of their kind of calls to action for their events. So I think what we want to think about is in part how music never completely disappears, right? That even as performance that can be very ephemeral, it's here 1 minute and then it's completely gone, that's what music actually begins to do, is even in those moments of live performance, it still impacts us in a particular way such that we move differently through the world after hearing it or seeing it or being party to it. And so hopefully that, you know, our engagements with music in whatever formation, whether we're listening on wax or seeing it live, starts to work on our bodies and work on our minds in those ways that we can carry it forward and begin to start to challenge other things we're listening to, challenge other people that we're in conversation with.
The director of the Hollywood Bowl Museum, and I want to thank you guys for a brilliant panel. What's been coming up for me is, you touched on it, and some of the questions have too, is that it can't just be about listening. It's got to be about doing. It's got to be about making music. So, you know, how do we do that maybe we missed a generation that didn't have enough music in the schools. But you know that the Philharmonic now is participating in this project called YOLA, Youth Orchestra Los Angeles, where there's 3 sites around the city, and one of them is just across the street from here. That's a partnership with the Recreation and Parks program. They're training hundreds of children to play music and sing. It can't just be about listening. What are your thoughts on this?
There's an organization that is doing something called Make Music LA, that you probably know about, that's the entire model of trying to set up through institutions across the city opportunities once a year to have kind of mass youth-based music making. It's happening. I mean, there was I'm blanking on the name, but the piano project, so there were pianos put all around Los Angeles last year. There was one at LA Live, I remember. But there were pianos that were just put out in public for people to go sit and play. Music Center's been doing like their ukulele fest, where like they flood the courtyard with anyone with a ukulele who wants to come in, and they do mass ukulele playing. So I think it's happening, and I think, you know, LA's always been a little slower than other cities to embrace free public culture in that organized sense. So I think it's happening. But we should invade the bowl. Let's do it. Let's go. You might know people there.
You know, but there's a sense where this mixes with social
Absolutely.
justice and social issues. It's just so important.
Absolutely.
Well, I was just gonna say, I couldn't have done this project without having first been a musician. Like, I just think there are things you cannot do without having actually been participating in the musical formation, and then also participating as an activist, as an organizer, or even as a participant, right? Someone who's actually out engaging in these communities in particular types of ways. And if you've noticed the mass demonstrations quite often, even those that were happening on May Day or those that have been happening around Occupy LA and things like that, there's always some kind of cultural element, whether it be giant puppets or art installations or music, right? That it's such an organic part of the way that people are engaging the world anyway, that it's a perfect opportunity to actually draw people in. So I completely agree with you that they have to go hand in hand. You have to be literate in a particular type of way, just like any other occupation or investment or interest. You have to develop your literacy around music, not just as a listener, but to struggle through participating, even if you can't hit notes. Like to try, right? To work with people.
Do you ever teach your students to sing the anthems?
I do, and I try to struggle with them also in reading it. So this question of the sheet music, right? To have that language under their belt, because it is a different language to read music. But I do think it has so much to do with the absence or the withdrawal of funding for those programs in our public schools. That's where hip hop comes from, right? They can't learn the brass instruments in school anymore, so they take the electricity to the streets. Right, so I think that there are ways that we have to be really vigilant about making sure young people have access to those opportunities and that we're modeling it for them. We're not just the paper pushers. We have to model it for them.
My good friend who's departed now, Percy Heath, with the Heath brothers, came to me years ago. He said, "Ron, do you know who the father of rap music is?" I go, Afrika Bambaataa? No. BJ Kool Herc? No. Whoa. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan. And it was a bit of a stretch, but but he said that it was during the Reagan administration that music programs did disappear, particularly in some of the inner city schools. So my point is in all of that, young people, all of us, we have this innate ability to create. We want to create, but again, this is what I mean, from the early caveman and cavewoman drawing on the walls, figuring out I got to transport from point A to point B. Let's come up with a wheel. We found ways to be creative, and there's something that's visceral about playing or singing and being engaged in music. My son, as a kid growing up, he graduated from USC a few years ago. But part of the rule in our house was you're going to play an instrument. Now some parents get worn down. I did. Every day, it's like, you want to eat? I got to have my 50 minutes on the piano. Every day. No, it's not negotiable. And now, he grew up to appreciate that because he can really play now. But so I was the original Tiger dad before Tiger Mom. I was out there saying, all right, we're going to do this. So I think the whole idea of playing and being engaged in music, it is something that happens to you when you do this on a regular basis. Now, not with the intent of being a professional musician. That's not important. That's really superfluous. What's important is that there be some involvement, some engagement in music making. You know, it doesn't matter about the quality. I mean, there are enough of us in music. I mean, in music, there is a supply and demand issue. There are more supplies than there is demand. So we're not worried about having a nice stockpile of great musicians. What's important is that we have lifelong participants, lifelong people who are engaged in music in some form or another.
So we have less than 5 minutes left. What I'll ask is maybe the last two questions, if you can ask them at the same time, and then we'll go quickly with the answers. Yeah, well, not the same time, but one after another.
Well, I just want to say something quickly. Like, I'm inspired by all the great music you guys are into, and I think you're underselling what you're talking about. If you go to a great concert, it is a religious experience. It is a communal experience. I've seen the Rolling Stones 13 times. If you haven't seen them, go see them. I remember in the late 70s seeing Stevie Wonder. The first artist was Gil Scott-Heron, you know, and then dancing with hundreds of people of all races. I mean, this works. What you're talking about happens. So that's. And I'm interested in any comment you have, but that's what I have to say.
I would say yes.
Thank you. Yes, amen.
Thank you for having this panel. My question is not really formulated, but I'm just going to free flow with it. One of the things that was strong about the music in the 60s and 70s was democracy was still evolving and movements in America, whereas now it's kind of like stagnant and there's like just massive commercialization and just a consumer-based economy, whereas in other parts of the world, democracy is kind of where we were in the 60s and 70s right now. And there's a lot of flux and transition between the older generations and the younger generations, and in particular, the Arab world is one area where with the Arab Spring movements and stuff like that. So, I'm just wondering what your take is on music coming out of those kind of transitional areas, and that unifies people, because this says let's get to where we feel alright, which is from One Love with Bob Marley. It's a Bob Marley lyric from One Love. Whereas in the saturated commercialized democracy, all the music tends to be divisive and like feeding your ego, like McCurdy Drive, like who your crew is, where you live. Whereas the music that lasts generations and transcends the music that lasts forever is the one that transcends that type of ego-based type of lyricism and unites people. So how do you see that progressing in these transitional areas of the world?
Great question, thank you. So I'll ask panelists to be brief. Maybe I'll just start us off quickly. My family's from Punjab, which was the area of northwest India that was partitioned in 1947 and became India and Pakistan. And what I've learned throughout my life is that even though Indian Punjabis are mostly Hindus and Sikhs, and Pakistani Punjabis are mostly Muslim, we eat the same food, we speak the same language, we listen to the same music, we watch the same movies, we watch the same television shows, we recite the same poetry. And so this notion of popular culture as a unifying force is something I've seen throughout my life. It's something that brings people together as opposed to dividing them. In terms of the previous comment, I do think that's important. I hate that I don't want to undersell that. There are critics who say, well, pop cultural diplomacy can only go so far. Yeah, it's great if, Israelis are listening to Palestinian hip hop and Palestinians are watching Israeli soap operas, but what does that really mean in terms of, say, a peace process? Or, you can talk about any region in the world. But in 2009, I helped organize the Concert for Pakistan, which I'll talk to you about at some point. But it was sort of a concert that raised awareness for what had been happening in Pakistan in the Swat Valley when Taliban came in, and you had 2 million internally displaced people. It was the largest internally displaced population in the world at the time. We had Indian performers and Pakistani performers. We broadcast to India and Pakistan. We had the concert in the United Nations General Assembly Hall. We had well-known musicians from around the world. And people said to me, well, nothing really happened. Just like nothing happened after the concert for Bangladesh, nothing happened after the Tibetan Freedom Concert, nothing happened after Live Aid. But my response to them was that no, something did happen. My hope is that it raised people's consciousness as to what was happening, that it provided great symbolic value to have Indian and Pakistani musicians performing together at the United Nations General Assembly Hall, and that inspiration matters. When people are inspired, then hopefully they will be inspired to act as well. So those are my thoughts on those two comments right there.
When I was the president of the Jazz Association, we had a guy by the name of Arnie Lawrence who lived in Israel, a great jazz musician. And he had this educational program where he brought in his young Israeli kids and Palestinian kids performing these wonderful jazz ensemble. And these kids were, really amazing musicians. And the ironic part about it is that these kids, and from our history, Israelis and the Palestinians, that's not a very logical combination of people living and being able to get along really well. But for the actual performance part of it, they created this amazing jazz ensemble comprised of Israeli and Palestinian kids, and it was the most powerful performances, and this went on for years. The irony of it was that their parents were killing each other, but the kids themselves were making music. So my takeaway from that was that, how powerful music could be. Who knows what long-lasting effects that will have, but it does tell us that music does have the ability to supersede any kind of political issues that one might be having at some point. And this was just one small example of these kinds of individuals who, like I said, who were killing each other. Parents were, but the kids were coming together making tremendous music.
Yeah, in the absence of music, I would just say to the prior comment that we can't do anything but undersell this conversation. We need to actually listen. If a DJ were here, I'm sure it'd be a different situation. There'd be no underselling.
Good time. So last thing I'd say about this is, for the Songs in the Key of Los Angeles concert we did at Grand Performances in August last summer, the free public concert in the heart of downtown Los Angeles. We had 5,000 people, all different backgrounds from across the city come. It ended with a surprise appearance by Stevie Wonder. And we had asked Stevie Wonder to sing the one song he had written explicitly about Los Angeles, which is called The Land of La La, which most of you probably haven't heard. And Stevie was shocked that anyone remembered he had ever recorded that song, and he decided to come out on stage and he was going to play it solo on piano with a Pro Tools backing track. Now there'd been a house band the whole show. It was Motley. We're a multiracial crew, many of you might know, politically minded, Los Angeles, Latino, African American, Jewish American, Asian American band. And in the middle of Stevie's solo performance in front of 5,000 people, his backing track went out. And he couldn't finish the song because he couldn't remember how to play it. And he's by himself on piano trying to figure on the keyboard, trying to remember through playing how to get back into the song. And all of a sudden, when it was clear that it wasn't going the right place, one of the members of Motley starts keeping a beat on a tambourine. And we all were freaking out that Stevie was gonna leave the stage, that somebody who wasn't his band was playing. And he then gestured to have them come on stage. They'd never heard the song before in their life. And they improvised behind him into a Latin American flavored jam behind him. He then went off on that song, and the whole band kicked in and took that song to like a 7-minute kind of Latin disco version of The Land of La La. And in the middle of it, Stevie did a bridge into La Bamba, which of course is both a Mexican folk song, but also an African folk song. It comes from the mix of Mexican and African musical cultures, and then went off into La Bamba, and they ended up then in an Motley song about the kind of mixtures of African and Latin American cultures that Stevie had never heard before. And that's how we ended the night. And it felt like a utopic moment, but it was also that it was about playing, Carol. It was about people were making music. But without those 5,000 people watching, listening, feeling, and driving that band, and then going home, hopefully changed, that moment wouldn't have meant so much. So I think it's got to be listening, and it's got to be playing, and we got to do it together, and we got to do it in public.
That's a great way to end our panel. I hope you're as inspired as I was. Please join me in thanking Josh Cruz, Ronald Reagan, Shana L. Make sure to check out Songs in the Key of Los Angeles, the Langston Hughes Project, Anthem, the book, and the mixtape, and Natural Mystics.
And book signings this afternoon.
You're doing a book signing this afternoon in Signing Area 1, which is located on the festival map in the center of the event program. So thanks again, everyone, for coming, and fight on.